Welcome to World Builders Anonymous. Kick that world building addiction and actually finish that novel with your hosts Vito and John.
Now do the thing.
Oh, 1, 2, 3, clap. 1, 2, 3, clap. You didn't clap, you clanked.
Well, I have a surprise for you, and that's a precursor to my surprise for you, which is, welcome to the podcast. Woo!
It's not a surprise if you do it like every other time.
Oh, it's been so long, though. When's the last time I did a can crack to start the episode?
Oh, I don't know. I expected more is all.
There's no pleasing you, John. No pleasing you. I did this just for you.
There's
nice
a
gesture.
tremendous amount of noise going on.
Let's try this again.
Okay. Oh, jeez.
Best I could do.
It was so much better the first time.
I know, but I wasted it.
Oh.
I may or may not include the first time because I don't know the damage to the audio track yet. I can't really tell, but we'll see.
Well, it was quite insane.
If you missed it, you missed it. It's just put it that way.
But we're back now. The proper crisp, delightful can crack is unfortunately lost to the annals of time.
The annals. Be careful.
The annals of time. You gotta be careful with that word.
Okay.
It's a dangerous one.
Anyway. Well, I have the deliciousness of black cherry soda water, but you guys have simply the disappointing, resonating of the tab, and that's about it.
The doink, the sad doink of the can tab.
A can tab.
And with that,
life is like the sad doink of a can tab sometimes. Anyway, enough about can tabs.
Sometimes you're expecting the nice crisp snap of a can top. Sometimes you just get the doink. And that's all this is.
Throwing truth bombs on this
Welcome
podcast.
to the Doink Cast.
It's another T-shirt idea. There you go. We should start throwing them every episode. New T-shirt idea. We should start doing that. Email us at this web zone if you would like to buy a T-shirt.
Also email us if you understand what
if you understand that reference. Yes.
Anyway, so today we have a couple of interesting topics. The first and I think the main one we don't have a ton to talk about. But
we're not
the first
very
one,
people.
That's very true. The first thing is we're going to talk a bit about dialogue tags and use that to jump into a talk about helpful criticism on first drafts. Specifically,
but Johnny, what's a dialogue tag?
Oh, well, my son, just wait. We'll get there.
I think I did that too early. You weren't quite done yet.
I wasn't done at all.
I was too eager.
Anyway, we're going to transition that into a talk about helpful criticism of first drafts, and specifically first drafts where you may not be confident in the quality of your writing. We're going to talk about a few areas that we've seen in beginner writers. Again, reminding you that we are ourselves quite beginner writers ourselves. But in some of the stuff that we've seen, the first things to look for and the things that we look for when reading people's first drafts, the things that indicate quality or lack thereof, or things that just in general are good things to point out when critiquing a first draft. And to start that, talking about dialogue tags.
But
to answer your question that I know you're going to ask, and I don't want you to ask again, dialogue tags are essentially, so if I was going to speak to you and I was writing down the conversation, I would say something like, hello, Vito, how are you? Said John. Or if I was going to get fancy, John said inquisitively, or that kind of thing. It's essentially the marker that lets you know who's speaking. And a lot of times authors, especially beginner authors and people who are not quite sure why their scene feels lifeless, will try to... Okay, so one thing we do is we look for patterns, right? We look for repetitive patterns in our writing, and we try to avoid them. So when we see a lot of over and over again, he said, she said, John said, Vito said, we go, oh, that's repetitive. And we try to change it up and make it more interesting. And we'll say, John inquired, or John asked sarcastically, or Vito pondered, or we'll start adding all these different fancy dialogue tags to try to make our writing feel less stale. And if you're keeping Vito, do you know something might be wrong with that? Do you wonder maybe what might be wrong with doing that?
I surmise
Purple prose.
What?
Vito, it's purple prose.
Purple prose. What?
You ever heard that term?
No, I've never heard that term.
Oh, you have much to learn, my friend.
I am learning something. Okay.
Purple prose. It's essentially, so when you think, and again, well, not again, I haven't said this yet. I don't know that this is why it's called purple prose, but in my brain, this is why it's called purple prose. So when I think purple, I think royalty, I think fancy, I think like opulent and unnecessarily decorated. That's essentially what we're talking about. Purple prose is when you're writing and it's too much. It's
gaudy.
too much, too gaudy, too ostentatious, too fancy, as it were. And sometimes it's a writing style that you might be going for in certain circumstances. But in general prose, it comes off as kind of annoying and just a bit too much. Kind of like you're really liking the way you're writing, and you're letting yourself take way too many liberties. And that's what it kind of reads like when you start putting in all these things. And the big problem with using all those fancy dialogue tags too frequently is that it's a misdiagnosis of the problem with your writing.
Or maybe a way to kind of distract yourself from the real problem, perhaps.
Exactly. So if you feel like your writing is stale and your dialogue isn't popping the way you want it to, in 99.9% of cases, it's not because you're not using fancy enough dialogue tags. It's because nothing is happening in your scene. So I was talking to a guy about his first draft, and this is essentially the main criticism that I had of the whole thing was you're using these dialogue tags. And I think it's because you think the scene is stale, and it is, but that's not why. The dialogue tags aren't the problem. The problem is, I compared it to filming a scene in reverse shot, where you have two cameras over each actor's shoulder, and you're just filming their faces while they're talking. That's essentially what you're doing when you're just writing, he said, he said, he said, he said, he said, back and forth with nothing else happening. It's a boring way to write a scene, and it's a boring way to shoot a scene as well.
Even if you're just using the generic he said, she said, and not trying to spruce it up too much with intoned or, those sorts of words.
Right. And adding those, fancier words doesn't change the nature of the scene. And that's the problem. It's not the words, it's the nature of the scene.
And kind of these stacks of dialogue that go on for, paragraphs.
Right. When you think about the way we actually communicate in real life, there's so much more going on than just the words we're speaking. And even in the way we're speaking them, you can add some of that with dialogue tags, but it doesn't change the tone of the scene because we're still not seeing what's happening. If I'm uncomfortable while I'm talking to someone, like let's say I'm in a job interview and I'm nervous, you might say he said nervously or something like that. But A, that's telling, not showing. And B, there's so many more lived in and functional ways to describe the fact that I'm nervous without just using that dialogue tag. You can say that I'm tapping my feet. You can say that I'm fidgeting with something on the table. You can say that I keep stroking my beard or something like that because, I'm nervous. And that way you avoid having to use a fancier dialogue tag. You can still just say he said, because that's, in most cases, that's the best way to use a dialogue tag, is just to say so-and-so said. That's the easiest and generally the best.
And it can be hard sometimes to know whether you've communicated what you want to communicate if you're not just resorting to outright saying what the character's feeling.
Right.
So, for example, if your character's nervous, like you were saying, you could write the scene and say, he said nervously, whatever he just said. Or you could say whoever's, the one talking to the nervous person could notice that the nervous person is tapping their foot or looking, flitting their eyes around the room or something like that. And you could think to yourself, I don't know if that's enough. Have I really communicated what I wanted to here? I'm not sure. If you're not used to doing this kind of thing. And that's where having another reader comes in handy, who's not familiar with the context of the scene like you are, because of course the person's nervous because you wrote the scene and it's all happening inside of your head.
Right.
And this is kind of one of those tools you need in your toolkit, or I guess the techniques like a painter would have, that you need to develop in order to really, I guess to use a painting analogy, really make something three-dimensional on the page or something like that,
Right.
instead of two-dimensional. And that's where other people can come in handy in looking at your writing and saying, well, this, or you can ask them, don't lead them onto it. Like, how would you say that this person is feeling in this scene, or is this kind
Yeah,
of
right.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, don't be like, can you tell they're nervous?
Yeah.
Leading the witness. Objection.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can't get upset when the person says, "No, I
Right.
didn't get that," you know, or
That's a big thing too.
yeah, because yes, of course, like I said, you know that, and it's easy to kind of say, well, they should have picked up on it, or maybe they just aren't, you know, sensitive a reader as I would be, or something like that. It's really easy to blame the person reading it, but it's really important to not necessarily take everything they say as legitimate and take every single criticism you ever get, but it's really important to really consider, man, that person, or if several people have read it and had the same reaction, really take that and say, maybe I could be describing this in a different way, or maybe there's something else I can be doing to communicate what I want to communicate and change something.
Right.
Not necessarily now, but make note of it, you know?
Yeah. Another pitfall in that kind of genre of dialogue tags is let's say I'm the perspective character, right? And so when this is weird Inception kind of thing. If I'm writing myself as the perspective character,
Whoa.
but I say Vito said nervously, I'm not in Vito's head. I'm in my head. And I don't know
I see what you're saying.
that Vito's nervous, but he's saying it nervously. Well, what does that mean? How does someone say something nervously? There's a danger of perspective breaks there. And it's better, again, in terms of showing versus telling, it's better to describe the behavior of people in ways that are visible in general. But also it's less confusing and just makes more sense if you avoid those things, because like I said, how do I know that Vito's nervous? I could just as well describe the tone of his voice to let you know that he's nervous instead of just saying it, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to just say that.
And it's more satisfying to kind of put the pieces together yourself rather than be kind of spoon-fed the emotions certain characters are feeling. Especially if, like you were saying, let's kind of unpack that a little bit more, because I almost missed it there for a second. You're saying that if you're writing a story from a certain character's perspective, or from even a narrator's perspective, that's not supposed to be omniscient. The narrator's not supposed to be in everyone's head, knowing exactly what's going on in everybody's head. If you then say this character said something nervously, that could constitute something of a perspective break, because you've suddenly, to at least a small extent, jumped inside of their head and seen what they're actually thinking. And yes, you could be going for a what's the word when you can't trust the narrator? I can't remember.
Oh gosh, why I would have known it if you hadn't prompted me.
I know, yeah. I just like it just
Oh
went right
my
out of my head.
gosh.
Unreliable narrator. Yeah,
unreliable narrator.
That's such a bad excuse, though, in 90% of cases, though.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Make sure you know whose perspective you're telling it from, and try to show from the person whose perspective you're trying to show from. Basically, who is observing that this other person is nervous, and what specifically are they seeing that's making them think that, not just they said it in a nervous tone of voice, because, we kind of know what that might mean. And that's maybe not the best example, because we kind of know what that might be, but it could be many things. And it's not just the way someone sounds, it's the things they do, or their posture, that kind of stuff. And that's just one small example.
Sure. As a general rule of thumb, you can describe the emotions directly of your perspective character, but for all other characters, it's best to describe things that are more tangible, because that's how we interact with the world. And again, and there's another note, if I say someone said something nervously, that's a guess. I don't know that, and when you say it in prose like that, it sounds very certain. It sounds very, very concrete, and the characters wouldn't know that. They might suspect it. You could say John thought to himself that Vito sounded nervous. That's a better way to say it, at least, because
say it more interestingly than that. But yes,
sure, that's a crappy sentence, but it at least gives you the idea that I think that's the case, but it's not necessarily true.
Yes,
the same effect is conveyed if I said Vito was fidgeting with something on the table, or if he's tapping his foot, or whatnot. That conveys the same idea that he seems to be nervous. You can even see Vito seemed to be nervous. Like you can
That's
convey
pretty
the
lazy
same
too, but
thoughts.
yeah.
Well, stop criticizing my sentence construction, Vito. I'm on the spot.
No, I mean, you're right. That it plays into the kind of that uncertainty I was talking about from the author's perspective, whether or not you've communicated enough about the certain character's maybe state of mind or that kind of thing. Because, yeah, you don't know if you've put enough clues in there to trigger that thought in the audience's brain necessarily. And that just comes with, I think, practice and knowing who you're talking to, knowing your audience, I think. And reading a lot and knowing what works for you.
Right.
So it is somewhat subjective. So, like I said, don't take everybody's opinion. If one person says, yeah, I didn't quite get that thing you were trying to get across, but everybody else does, like maybe that's something you should maybe just sweep under the rug.
Right. And this all raises an important question, and that is, what of all this criticism is valid and helpful in a sort of a first draft context? I don't think all of that we just covered was necessarily good stuff to point out in the first draft.
It depends.
I'm not.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
for example, I'm not going to criticize someone for saying a sentence like Vito seemed nervous. It's not a great sentence, but in a first draft context when there's more glaring issues, it's probably not the best idea to go into that kind of detail because it's going to be overwhelming. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it depends on what the person is looking for. So when you give something that you've written to somebody to critique or give you their opinion on, make sure you let them know what you're wanting from them, I guess. Are you wanting to know whether this piece seems to have some promise, whether the story is intriguing and you find yourself wanting to know more when you finish it, like a certain chapter maybe that you've written, a piece of a bigger thing that you're not sure if you want to pursue further or not yet? If you have a particular character that you want somebody's opinion on, or if you want to know whether this is something that, if this is something you've polished a bit and is pretty near to what you kind of want the final product to look like, let them know that. Where are you in your process?
Right.
What are you wanting from them in terms of their critique?
That's important.
Usually it seems like a lot of beginners, and I've been guilty of this as well at some points, want kind of a pat on the back when they show somebody their unfinished work. That's like, oh man, they're gonna see, yeah, it's got some mistakes, but I'm actually it's really brilliant. It's really got.
It's
some
better
promise.
than most people's first try.
Like they're gonna see the world and all the intricacies of it and really fall in love with it, and it's gonna be awesome. I don't know why I'm doing my Donald Trump voice right now. It's very, very strange.
It's the best story.
It's the best
There's never
story.
been a story like it.
Oh gosh.
Sorry. Yeah, and that's important. And remember, this is an important thing to remember here when you're submitting work for people to see. It's your baby. It's your darling. You've slaved over it for hours. But to other people, it's something they're comparing to the works of extremely talented writers.
And it's something that's taking
And
up their time.
They may not love it. Yeah.
That they're putting effort and sometimes hours of time into reading and looking over, so it's, especially if it's not compelling, it can be quite a chore to get through sometimes.
Oh yeah.
Unless you're like some people who really love tearing people apart and just complaining about everything.
And I do enjoy a lot of times going through works that aren't necessarily the best written and finding the things that I like about them. I often find that people have really good ideas. I think that it may be that the ideas are easier to come up with than the prose is to write, or maybe it just depends on who you are. But there are people who have really, really solid creative ideas for stories that I haven't, even thought of before. And the writing just lets it down, and I can see the direction they want to go, but it's just not working. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be. And there are a few core things that I look at when I'm critiquing a story, especially a first draft of like a first chapter. I'm not going to go into, I rarely will critique grammar, almost at all, because that's very fixable later in many cases, not all necessarily, but grammar is also not my thing. I have a wife who's very good at that kind of thing, and I let her handle it.
That's why there's literally different types of editors for that sort of thing, as opposed to
exactly
story and stuff.
And that's not my wheelhouse. What I look for is, first and foremost, are you getting me interested in the story within a couple pages? Do I care about what's going on at all? You don't have to have like a dramatic hook in the first page or the first paragraph or the first sentence. A lot of people you can tell are trying really hard to pack that hook in really quickly.
Like you can see them trying to manufacture that right
Yeah,
off the bat.
they're
and
like they're gonna.
okay.
People will lose interest if I don't put the hook in the first paragraph. I'm like, no, you don't. That's not necessarily true. In fact, if it doesn't fit in the first paragraph, then you shouldn't put it there. You can get us interested in other ways if the writing is good and the characters seem interesting. If the characters are doing something. My goodness. Characters need to do things, especially early on. I don't care if it's raking the yard. Like, do something.
Rather than just
Don't
talk
start-
to someone.
Just like a garden variety conversation, or just a 2-paragraph description of the context, because you
As
feel like
they-
we're going to be lost
as-
if we're not caught up.
Or a description of the main character as they find a mirror very conveniently and look at
Oh,
themselves.
jeez. Yeah. I think that I don't think it's intentional, but I think as authors we sometimes don't trust our readers to be able to understand what's happening, and so we go into great detail to kind of catch them up. There was a story I read recently where it was the first chapter I found on Reddit, and it was essentially some kind of precursor to your standard young person coming of age in warrior school doing their final test thing to become the most cool person in the world, that kind of thing. It was a well done twist on it, and it was creative. Well, the idea, I mean, but to begin the whole thing, it was a few paragraphs describing like the scene of all that, of the pre-ceremony to the journey to go to the final test. And it's not interesting. That's not what I came for. Especially because you promised me a final coming of age test in the first paragraph, and then we jumped into all this description. And I want to see something happen. I want to see people doing something. I want to see characters in motion so I can learn about them and start to care about the world and the characters involved. You have to pay attention to that kind of thing for sure.
Yeah, and that could definitely spin into like how do you make description interesting, because it's of course necessary sometimes.
Sure.
But of course, yeah, you want to keep your opening gripping without being sensationalized, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So the first thing you look for is what's happening early on, and am I interested? And if I'm not interested, I'll let you know. Like, you're starting to lose me. You need to do something soon, or I wouldn't continue reading if this was a book. And then the next thing I start to look for is the dialogue. I'm looking at the dialogue and the dialogue tags and kind of seeing if you can kind of tell when people get it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. You
can tell when they're cognizant of what they're doing. They're doing things on purpose and not just writing down every thought they have and every, it's not like they're just seeing the conversation and just spitting the conversation on the page. They're trying to write a scene, including dialogue. There's a big difference between writing, a conversation and writing a scene with dialogue in it.
Yeah.
And you need to do the latter.
Yeah, in 99% of cases, there's people who get bored with kind of the typical way of writing, I think, and like some more fancy quote unquote authors who experiment with different sort of ways of doing things, and maybe like they make one chapter is just dialogue and that's it, nothing else. You can kind of tell from context who's talking and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, great. If you can pull that off, fine. Like, do that. That's fun. But
most of the time,
yeah, we're talking your typical kind of standard getting your feet wet kind of thing.
Yeah, right. One of the more granular things I look at, to some extent, not super in depth, and if there's not like egregious examples to the contrary, I won't say anything. But I do look at sentence structure to see if there's two things I look for. One is every sentence being the same, and that it just feels bad to write. And if you keep doing that, you're going to have a ton of work and revision.
The same in terms of like pacing, kind of length,
right?
That kind of thing.
So every sentence is two thoughts connected by one comma.
Yes, I've done this when I was just starting a lot.
Yeah, or every sentence has no commas. It's just thought. Those are the main two things. If you have any combination other than just like a bunch of those two, it's kind of okay.
Yeah, yeah.
But man, you can just kill yourself writing a ton of sentences like that, and then you realize it later on, and you have to fix everything.
Yeah, I did that a lot. Like I said, when I started, and I still have this tendency. I found it in myself where I'll write a
I do
sentence,
too.
put a comma, a gerund, and then continue to elaborate on the previous sentence a little bit or previous clause a little bit after the comma, and then period. And then I just would do that over and over and over again. I would read back some of my stuff after a while of not writing and be like, "Oh my gosh, what have I done?"
Right.
And
It's an effective way of
an
effective way of writing thoughts and getting words out on the page, but it's not the most dynamic to read.
And it can flow. I've found if you do it just enough, but too much, man, it becomes bad. And that's a good thing to keep in mind too. Like, you're not going to notice a lot of these tendencies a lot of times at first. It really takes having other people look at your work, looking at old work that you haven't looked at in a while.
That's
with
a big
fresh
one.
eyes. That really helps a lot. I've found in your own writing, and find someone you trust and listen to them.
Yes.
Don't fight them on like, well, this is what the flow I was going for. Like,
You just don't understand
you
my
just don't
genius.
understand my exactly. Yeah.
But another way that sentence structure can kill you is if every now and again you throw in these sentences that have like 15 different thoughts in them, all connected by a bunch of commas, and they're never a good idea to write. There are probably exceptions, but I'm going to go ahead and say never, because it's just a generally good idea to avoid them. You have these sentences that go on and on and on, and by the end of it, I have no idea what was supposed to be conveyed by the sentence in the first place.
And that's somewhat grammatical, but it's still important. Yeah,
It's important because
and it's an indication of whether the person kind of gets it. Kind of
sure,
knows at all what they're doing.
And that's not an exclusive club, by the way. You can learn to get it. It just takes. And not saying we always get it either, but there's a lot of practice and a lot of. I think one of the best things is just to read good books that are written well, and you'll just learn it.
Yeah, and like we were saying, in giving feedback for a first draft of something, it's something to mention, but not like harp on too much necessarily.
Yeah, right.
The things.
And again,
sorry, go ahead.
I don't mention it unless it's something I'm seeing a lot of, and it's usually I find the previous example where it's consistently very samey and bland sentence structure, and I mention that more of a convenience to them to recognize that than an actual criticism, because again, it's just going to save them a lot of time down the road if they can recognize that and try to combat it while they're writing.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, would you say there's a primary thing you look for when someone sends you something to look at, and they're like, don't like really give you much leading? They're just like, hey, give me your thoughts on this. Blah. Here's a 2-chapter section.
Yeah. Most of the time people just send one chapter at a time, I've found, just as a side note. But again, make sure it's interesting to begin with. Make sure the characters have some kind of unique tone. A lot of times in beginner writing, all the characters feel exactly the same.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out. I know that for myself.
Establishing character tone is one of the harder things about writing to me, because you have... I feel like I don't have a lot of time where specific characters are actually speaking to establish tone. And it's just definitely a skill you have to learn. And it's hard, and it's not one of the really basic things. So again, that's not one of the ones I mentioned too much. One is if it even makes sense. Sometimes these chapters people send or that I read on Reddit
on a logical scale, you mean?
I don't follow. Yeah. There's a couple examples I came across recently, but just things happen. I push my computer back from my chair and go, nope, I don't believe you.
Like certain characters would not be putting up with this from another character, or maybe like that's not how things work. What's happening
like
here?
He would have noticed the other person doing that. Why are you pretending like it's some secret? He was right there. I don't believe that he wouldn't know this is going on.
Yeah,
like things like that, where
basically
logical errors that will kill your story if you don't fix them.
No matter how brilliant the rest of it is, there's only so much people will kind of suspend disbelief for if something's not making sense.
And the higher fantasy you're going with, the more suspense has to be suspended, or disbelief has to be suspended. And if you break that chain where suddenly I don't believe you anymore, you're done. Like you can't recover from it, really.
And maybe that's not everybody, but that's how I am as well. Like if especially in the early stages of a book, like you don't really expect it to get better after a certain point. You're just kind of like, okay, I can tell the rest of this is going to be what I've got so far, so I'm kind of done with this now.
Yeah.
So it's really important, especially in the beginning, to have that suspension of disbelief really functioning well and not snapping out of nowhere.
Yep. Pacing is a big one. A lot of times people don't know how fast or how slow to go with their ideas, and so they'll pack 5 chapters of material into 1 chapter, and you're way lost. You have no idea what's going on, and it's going too fast. You don't have any time to understand the characters. There's no character moments. There's hardly any dialogue. It's, what could be a whole chapter of events where you learn about the world and the characters is a 1-sentence conclusion of, he did this. Like, he escaped from the prison. That was one that I
really?
read. And yeah,
Wow.
it described how he got out of his cell, and they basically just said he walked out. Like, okay, how? There's a whole story there. There's a whole lot of stuff to cover, and that's one of those things where I just go, no, I don't believe he just walked out of the prison. Is he a ghost? What's
and
going
maybe
on?
the person could be like, well, it wasn't finished yet. I was going to add that part later. Like, well, don't show me yet. This
Yeah,
isn't
that's
ready
one
to be
thing about
shown.
it too. Yeah. So pacing is a big one, and it helps. I think when I try to look at in first chapter specifically is things that are gonna be important for the writer to understand moving forward. Pacing, characters, writing, having stuff happen. The story being in motion constantly. No wasted time doing things that don't matter. Keeping the story moving, keeping the characters moving. Dialogue tags to some extent, sentence structure. These things that if you take them and understand the concepts and if you were to write the chapter again, you'd write it completely differently and way better. Those are the things that you look for specifically. Don't get wrapped up in word choice. Don't say something like, you said, I can't think of an example, write it really quickly. Or something like, you said he hopped on that box, but you should have said he leaped on it. Like, that's not a good first chapter criticism of a first draft, because that's so unimportant in the grand scheme of things. And if you pointed out every single example like that of personal preference, you would never finish with the review. You have to focus on bigger picture concepts. You have to focus on things that matter in a larger context and things that are structural, not just specifically sort of a diagnosis and a fix for some kind of minor thing, something that's going to make the writing better long term. You're not fixing, putting a Band-Aid on something. You're like prescribing a physical therapy routine.
Right.
That's a weird example, but whatever.
Yeah, because most likely this is all going to be rewritten anyway, and none of the specific words are going to be there later in any case. Although it can be good to point out, like, if someone's using a specific word too many times, you're like, okay, this is...
Yeah, that's a good one.
I noticed this now. It's happened so many times. Maybe just be aware of this going forward. Just a
Trends,
little note.
things like that.
Nothing big.
Yeah, right.
But yeah. I felt like there was something else I was going to say, but I can't think of it now. That's probably a good place to wrap that up for now, though.
Sure. I think there's a lot more we could talk about with review. And we were talking about maybe trying to find some people who'd be willing to let us see their stuff and use it as an example of this kind of thing. And we could go over something specific with you guys. Not sure if that's going to pan out fully, but we will see.
Good and, bad, and sort of stuff that's great and stuff that's maybe an example of something that could be fixed later, or an example of some of these tendencies, or things that things that show promise in a story in a first draft that maybe aren't all the way polished, but show that there's something meaty here that should be kind of brought out even more, something like that.
Maybe we can go into some of the stuff that we've written over.
Yeah, we thought about too, going back into some of, especially my old work that I used to do, and analyzing that in this way, and kind of pointing out some of those things that I was mentioning a little bit earlier. But yeah, if that's something that would be interesting, go ahead and send us an email or something, and Johnny will be happy to reply.
The custodian of our email.
Yes.
Speaking of our email, you can find that
email.
I
thought you were going to say that somebody emailed us.
Oh, no, they didn't.
Oh, okay.
It's a very lonely place. Oh! I'll actually get to that in a second.
Okay.
Our email address is wbapodcast@gmail.com. If you want to have us look at your work, Can't guarantee that we can go over like a whole manuscript, but if you send us a chapter, we'd be more than happy to take a look at it for whatever that's worth. We are on Reddit, on the fantasy writers subreddit primarily, WBA_podcast. You can find us on all the social medias at World Builders Anonymous. We have a website if you're interested in checking that out. That's www.worldbuildersanonymous.com. And if you want to leave a review for the show on iTunes, we'd appreciate that. Do you remember, Vito, a while back when I had an angry rant about iTunes reviews?
Mm-hmm. I do.
I told people to go over there and give a review and just say good job. Do you remember that? You remember me doing that?
Yeah, I do.
Someone did it.
Yes.
Some beautiful person actually went and did it.
Oh my gosh.
You fabulous person. His username is I'm Just a Will.
I'm
very grateful for him.
Is that also in his username, or is that something you added?
That's just the username on iTunes.
No, his username is I'm Just a Will, and I'm very grateful for him.
Oh no, just that, just
okay.
the first part.
I was confused.
Very grateful for I'm Just a Will. He did exactly what I requested. So thanks for that, bud.
Oh man, it's like
made me very happy.
It's the second best thing that'll happen to you in the next 2 months.
Indeed.
For context, Johnny's wife is having a baby next month.
Yes. Due the 14th. So
nice.
barely over a month.
Oh man, that's gonna be so crazy.
Yes, it's awesome.
Anyway,
I think that's everything.
Yep, I think so. We already did the
Yep.
We already did the plugs. I don't know how to finish this
all.
now. I know.
Do you want?
Here you go.
Oh, okay.
Full circle.
Doink.
Doink.
Bye, everyone.
This show is sponsored in part by Audible. Visit worldbuildersanonymous.com/audible to check out what the guys are listening to right now and to receive a free audiobook.